All right. Well, first off, I want to tell y'all thank you for coming out for this, and those of you online as well. Thank you for watching. My name is Christian Wright. I'm the president of the Morehead State Historical Society, also affectionately known as the History Club. We are sponsoring Dr. Adrian Mandzy, our resident Eastern European history expert, to put on this talk and kind of give us a little framework for what's going on since it is different culturally and historically from kind of what us here in the States are used to. So, Dr. Manzi.
Hi, guys. I appreciate you coming out on this really nice afternoon. It's sunny, it's warm. I know what kind of struggle that is to get actually somewhere on this kind of nice weather because you really want to be somewhere that, well, on a certain level, I really don't want to be here either because the topic that we're going to be talking about is something that is very close to me and what's going on. Unfortunately, it's a tragic turn of events that when I first heard about what happened last week, I was in shock. For the last couple of days, I've been mostly standing on the phone, checking Facebook, social media, colleagues and friends and distant family relatives in Ukraine to see who's still alive. So it's been a very tragic thing. And a former student asked me to talk about it, and I had a hard time saying something because of how close and deep this is. As most intellectuals, we're sort of look at academia stuff, we sort of step away from it. And historians, we love the past, right? It's safe, we know the outcome, we know how it ends. This is something that's a ball that's still rolling. So I did a small thing for NPR with one of our former students who graduated from us. And then I had a couple other students in my class ask me to tell them what's going on. I figured, well, maybe this is a way of doing it. So I'm gonna talk a little bit. I've got some pictures, I've got some slides, and then we'll talk. You guys have questions. It's gonna be a little different perspective probably than what you're used to hearing. So a little bit of myself. When I grew up, my parents and my grandparents came from Ukraine. I heard stories from my grandma about how in World War I they were living in western part of the country that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Russians came and burned their house down. That's one of like the first childhood memories. And at the time I couldn't really understand my grandma obsessed about it. But as she got older and I was still very young and didn't really understand, it was clear this was really important to her, having her own place, because for the rest of her life, she was always somewhere in transit. She was born under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then for a while, there was the Ukrainian Republic. Then there was Poland. Then there was the Soviets. Then there were the Nazis. And then she was nobody. She was wandering around Europe with my mom in tow. And then ended up coming to the United States. So, I sort of heard these stories. There was a large Ukrainian ghetto. The term sort of meaning the fact that all these refugees sort of came together and try to figure out life in the future. So my dad's story is a little bit different, but not much. He got to the United States, went to high school for 6 months, and then got a draft notice to go to Korea. So that was his sort of introduction. And he always referred to people, Anglos and us. He always said himself, part of the story, but different. So it's a little bit different story than most of you guys are aware of, right? As the Ukrainian refugees, they sort of hung together because they all had gone through some horrible things. And they try to recreate those things that foreign governments try to take away from schools, churches, social clubs. And well, by the time I was around, most of the Ukrainians were financially able to leave the ghetto, but they'd built all these institutions. So you'd hung around there for Saturday school, there was Ukrainian school, Ukrainian churches, social clubs, and that way. So I grew up in two worlds, really. So I had my Anglo friends, the kids I went to school with from the neighborhood, and I had my Ukrainian friends. And it was living like in two different places. A picture I found not too long ago from one of the Ukrainian scouting camps. I got hair. So I was like, wait, I know that kid. That's my pet mate. And then I found, oh, that's even me. And I was like, wow. So I figured I'd throw that out there. But it was sort of a world that the two didn't really fit together. Things you learned in one school were a little bit different from what you learned in American schools, right? There's a different focus. By the time I graduated from college. Me and a friend of mine had the opportunity to go to Ukraine, travel there for the first time. I made some contacts. I sort of knew I liked the academic lifestyle. I wanted to have an interest in archaeology, and that's what I was working on at the time. I got invited to go to an excavation. I was actually one of the first Americans to take part in field excavations in the Soviet Union at the time. That's me and a buddy of mine from some of the stuff we found. In 1990, I studied in Kiev. And at this time, a bunch of former dissidents had put together a school of Ukrainian studies, and I was in the first class. And then for 10 years, I ran a nonprofit organization that sort of focused on my American background, stuff I learned in school on historic preservation and public history in the city of Kamenice-Podilsky. Kamenice-Podilsky's history is sort of tragic. It was a major important center in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but after the Turkish occupation of the 18th century, it sort of collapsed. And it was in nobody's interest to talk about the different ethnic groups that sort of lived together. You had Armenians, you had Ukrainians, and you had Poles all sort of interacting with each other in this urban level. So I spent about 10 years of my life working on that. Other places as well. Most of it was in Kamenets, but in Khotin, Kyiv, Poltava, Boru, Crimea. And along the way, I picked up a PhD in my spare time. And I've continued after that, after coming to Morehead almost 20 years ago now. Well, actually more. Still working in the world of battlefield archaeology, which is a lot of past conflict in Ukraine, public history, and with keys, taking students overseas. And some people here actually had the opportunity to go. And then 2014 happened. Generally across the board, life goes on. We talked about feeling sorry for the events, and then we sort of moved on with our lives. And forgot about it. And then last week, Kyiv was attacked. Just looking at these pictures, you're seeing the level of devastation that this part of the world, pretty much anywhere in Europe, hasn't seen since 1945. I taught at that place. I gave a series of lectures at Kharkiv. That's our History and Architectural Restoration Institute. That's what it looks like today, or yesterday. So how did it all start? Is it because of the name? Well, why is there a war? So as a historian, what are we going to do? We're going to go back into the past and try to find out. We've got our time machine, right? Pick one you like better. If you don't get the reference, you can look it up later. So 1,000 years ago, there's this mythical land called the Rus. They had art, they had architecture, they had big cities, including flush toilets, which is really cool. They had a legal system that women could sue men for property. They had elected government officials that could get rid of a prince if they didn't behave properly. They had all these kind of cool things. And then, that's the capital, Kyiv. That's the Ukrainian spelling, K-Y-I-V. That's the main church, the St. Sophia Cathedral. There's a lot of churches. There was like 40 of them within the city itself. This one survives. As you can see on the left slide, very intricate mosaic, sort of Byzantine type style. The outside of the church is rebuilt in the 17th century, what they call the Ukrainian Baroque, and it still stands today. That's what Moscow looks like in 1065. A little bit of nature in there. So in 1240, when the Mongols come, pretty much this is blitzed. There's nothing really left standing. There's some fragments that survive in the mountains of Halych. The kingdom of Daniel will survive. Novgorod, that's in the swamps. Mongols don't really do well in swamps. They survive. But pretty much everything else goes away. So if we go for the next 200 years, there's the idea of the Rus, who takes the historical legitimacy of the place, right? Most likely it's Lithuania, because they actually pick up the language, pick up the laws, pick up all sorts of things from it, architecture. What happens in Moscow? Well, Moscow does actually be founded during the Kievan period, but it's a small outpost and becomes a center under the Mongols. For 300 years, the Mongols grow the city. They are the leaders of the city. They are the population. And then when Moscow starts to expand after the Mongols collapse, they need to justify what they're doing. Why are they going against Lithuania? And they come up with this idea of gathering the land of the Rus. And this becomes this critical ideology that's going to be driving their military actions for the next few hundred years. Any territory that was Rus, that's ours. We're going to go for it. So there's this idea that's been floating around that Ukraine doesn't really exist until the 20th century. That's completely wrong. As a historian, I can say to that. Here we see a nice map. This one is done by a Frenchman by the name of Beauplan. He was a military cartographer. In the corner of the map, he said description of Ukraine, and he shows a couple of Cossacks who live there. So the idea that Cossacks are living in Ukraine is already sort of the norm in the 17th century. For Ukrainians, the 17th century has a historical event that sort of sets it apart from many of the neighbors. They have a revolt. The Cossacks who are living there, peasants, old nobles, react against the Polish-Lithuanian nobles. They have a war, and then they establish their own government. It's often referred to as a war of national liberation. A term as a historian I really wasn't really keen on, but today I'm starting to like it a lot more. They establish their own state. But the problem of keeping a state is you got to have friends, and it doesn't seem to last. So they talk with everybody and their uncle, all their neighbors. And in that, they also talk with Moscow. This new thing that's sort of coming on board, it's not that far away, not too close. It seems like a possible ally. That doesn't seem to work out. Moscow pretty much stations troops in the capital. Ukrainians, Cossacks will fight against the Moscow guys in 1659. They just completely destroy them. So Moscow's dates are wide open for the Cossacks, the idea that they're going to get invaded. Cossacks say, we don't really want to go there. We just want to stay in our land. We have no interest in expanding. Moscow will then use soft power. The idea of buying people off, having people play off against each other, which is going to crack that state, that Cossack state. A couple more dates. I know it's, for those people not really into dates, but for us as historians, we use them as markers, sort of tell us along the path what's going on. We've got a Cossack by the name of Mazeppa, who is allied to the Moscow Tsar. He's not really active kind of guy. He mostly spends his time building churches and doing art kind of stuff, right? He really likes the Baroque art. He's really into printing books, okay? But during the Great War, the Swedes are going towards Ukraine. Mazeppa asks the Russians for support, and they don't get it. So he says, well, I'm getting invaded, so I'm going to, well, our contract is null and void. You broke your social contract, and makes a deal with the Swedes. When Moscow hears about it, they destroy the Cossack capital and slaughter every person in there. About 10,000 people have been executed at that site. The following year at Poltava, the Cossack-Swede alliance is defeated, and the Russians now come into existence. There really is no Russia to speak of before Poltava. This is a new thing, because now we've gathered enough of the lands to make a claim that we're actually Russia. We change the coins, we change the maps, we change the titles on the embassy. So really, Russia really begins only after Poltava. So during the 18th century, the Cossacks work with the state. Some have advancements, some get noble status, others don't. And then there's that German woman, Catherine, tries to even out the same playing field because she believes in the idea that everybody should be the same, right? Trying to make everybody follow the same laws, and goes out of her way to destroy the last vintages of the Cossack legal system, titles, and also makes the language illegal. It's not going to be the first time. It's not going to be the last time that this happens. And in the 19th century, to talk about Ukraine, you're really talking about literary movements. Historians, cultural people looking at how people make cloth and what kind of designs they do on their Easter eggs. And it's a period of literary growth. And you have a number of individuals. So if we just quickly look at a couple of them, I'm not going the full list, because there are a lot of these guys that write. It's the 19th century. That's what people do in their spare time, right? There's Kotlярewski, who writes this novel, sort of story poem based on Greek heroes, but he writes it in Ukrainian which is naughty. And then he changes all the characters into all the Greek guys into Cossacks. All right, it's sort of popular as an underground sort of book thing to it, right? There's Shevchenko, who's born as a serf, which is like a slave but different. Take my 271 class, we'll learn more about that. Right? He's on the lowest rungs of society, but he writes stuff. And he doesn't mince his words. He doesn't like a lot of things that he sees. He's a social justice warrior, if you want to use a 21st century term for him. And he really doesn't like the Russian imperialist model. Doesn't like imperialist models at all. and he actually does have a contact with a lot of people around the world, even African Americans from the United States. Franco, who's a socialist, right, who talks about all the problems that the outsiders who come in, and you got Lesya Ukrainka, a woman writer who's one of the first feminists in literature, right? She's talking about mythical creatures and a rejection of the industrial world, sort of a hippie. Let's go with that term, right? So the big thing in the 19th century that the Russian Empire is trying to figure out is how to deal with the language. And they're going to go out of their way to say it doesn't exist. It never existed, does not currently exist, and never can. So when Putin says there is no Ukraine before 1917, there's something created by Lenin, you can say bullshit on that, right? Because you don't pass a law outlawing something if it's not there. And you usually pass a law when it's a law against a language or a culture because you're afraid of it. And we're already having that. Well, Lenin's not in power yet. Let's go with that. The other thing that people seem to forget, Ukraine tried to set up a government in 1917. After the collapse of the old imperial dynasty, a social democratic national republic is formed. Some people call them Nazis before there's even Nazis out there, or nationalists. The guy who runs a social democrat, he talks about the people all the time. If you read his historical writing, God knows a lot of it. You know, he's got a 10-volume history, and only goes up to 1650 something. Right? He just talks about the people all the time. The other guy is a socialist lawyer. But they are sort of defending the right to speak of the language of the time. The Republic doesn't survive because it keeps on being attacked by everybody. They don't have the allies, they don't have the friends. And both the Bolsheviks go out of their way to crush them, and so do the white nationalist Russians. In the 1920s, Ukraine goes through this period of cultural boom. Lenin doesn't see it as a threat. He's thinking about a world revolution, so he doesn't care what language you speak. So there's this growth during this time period of literature, art, avant-garde, weird stuff, right? You know, Stalin despises this whole thing when he comes to power in the 1930s. And he goes out of his way to try to destroy Ukraine as an ethnicity, as a cultural, as a people. First, he attacks the intellectuals, put them in prison, execution. You play a traditional Ukrainian instrument, look good, let's get all you together, we'll pay for a conference, and then we'll kill all of you there when you show up. In 1932-33, Ukraine experiences a genocide, so-called the Holodomor, where 6 million people, according to some numbers, some say it's a little bit 3.5, some people have the number of 10, are starved to death. Literally, there's so much grain that the Soviets are selling in the market while the people are starving, and they deny it ever happened. And in 1939, Stalin invades Poland and lays claims to an area where Ukrainians have been living for centuries, and he destroys the Ukrainian Catholic Church. World War II is a tragedy. Some people think it's a great thing. It is a tragedy. For those people who went through it, it was a tragedy. Millions of people's lives are destroyed and cut short. People go through unspeakable horrors. It's not a good time for anybody. It is a dark time. And Ukrainians try to survive. Some fight with the Soviets, some with the Nazis. Some try to create their own national government, this nationalistic state. Without any support from anybody else, they field an army of about 100,000 people and will fight throughout the 50s, some until the early 60s. So we get to the 1960s. We're getting there, all right, as they say, right? Closer to our own time. There's this period of thaw. Khrushchev is the one that people talk about. It happens in each of the Soviet republics. And there's dissent. And it comes from the corner that nobody thought it would come from. It comes from good party members and their kids who are thinking differently. They use the Soviet Constitution to challenge things like human rights. And it says here in black and white in the Constitution that that's okay, you're still going to prison. The Ukrainian Helsinki groups, civil organizations, they focus on the ideas of human rights. And today we sort of say, well, that's sort of strange. Well, it's not really, because in the United States we sort of go through the same thing, right? The same general ideas. By the 1980s, it's a different time. Right? Chernobyl goes up. That's sort of like the big challenge to the Soviet system. For years, people believe we're number one. We've got the best tech in the world. We've got the best thing. And what happened to the Chernobyl plant? Have you seen that series? Some of you may have. Goes boom, right? And all these guys, they were repressed. These academics sort of come out of the woodwork and start to organize themselves along with younger people. And they talk about Ruch, sort of like Solidarity wasn't Poland a couple of years earlier. Then there's all sorts of things happening. It starts happening really quickly. This is where I sort of fall in, right? I'm at a conference. They're celebrating the 500 years of Cossacks. They love zero numbers in the Soviet system. They did everything. Every party was possibly partied with a zero event number, right? They did this 500-year thing, and it was supposed to be an academic discussion. It sort of came with chants of let the KGB live at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, things of that nature. It was a people's movement. A lot of students camping out, the hunger strike, the revolution on granite that happens in 1990. Handfuls of individuals challenging the authority and power of the state. In 1991, Soviet Union collapses. I'm there. I actually see this in front of my eyes. I see guys wandering around, really, really scared the first couple of days. Guys in City Hall. I have a bunch of students with me. My first time taking students overseas. Yay. What could possibly go wrong? Week before we're all going home, the whole system looks like it's going to collapse. And, the guy's talking about, can we make the machine gun that's in the Historical Museum active again? What's going to happen? How are we all going to get home? And then 3 days later, it collapses. There's no boom. There's not even much of a whimper. The whole system implodes. And for a lot of people, they're in shock. Nobody expected it that quickly. Even the opposition, when they're having their demonstrations, are pretty much focusing on one dissident who's in prison. It's got to get him out. That's at 10 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, they're demanding independence. That's how quickly things moved. So the first president of Ukraine is an old communist. Doesn't really believe in the system, but he's a slimy little devil, so he manages to turn his coat and adopt symbols that Ukrainians use in their struggle for independence over the generations. So the different presidents, there's a very Western-leaning guy. He happens to have a car accident. It's unclear what happened, and a lot of people think that was sort of a prearranged car accident. The Moscow-friendly President Kuchma writes a book, Ukraine is not Russia. He is an industrial as they come, and yet he sort of is turning in the direction of Ukraine, right? Putin's book, Putin really doesn't understand this. He should have read it. In the 90s, Ukraine also gives up its nuclear weapons. At the time, it seemed like the right thing to do. Boris Yeltsin is in Moscow. He has no territorial claims to Ukraine. He's very democratic-leaning. Ukraine also is bankrupt and is promised aid by Western governments. And if in case something ever happens, the United States and Great Britain sign on dotted line that they'll protect. 2004, there's an attempt to discredit the Western-leaning movements in Ukraine. So you're getting society where, they have elections and people have different opinions. Some say we should go this way, some we would go this way. This candidate here is poisoned by the Russian. It doesn't kill him, but it does leave him deformed. People come out to the streets, and the opposition backs off. They're runoff elections, and the Orange Revolution comes to force. Ukraine started moving towards the west. But we expect everything to happen to you. All the wonderful things will be cured overnight. Sometimes when those dreams don't come to fruition, people get disenchanted. And in 2004, a neutral candidate, this guy said he's not going either way. He's going to be in the middle, comes to power. And then he says he's not going to sign a economic deal with the EU for trade relations. People come to protest in December of 13. Handful of people. It's cold. What do you want to do in December? Do you want to be outside? Anybody want? No, it's not a good time to go outside. Maybe in Sarasota, Florida or someplace. Maybe. Not here, right? Christmas is around the corner. Demonstrations are getting smaller and smaller. And then one day, they decide to use the cops to break it up. And then something happens. They call the parents. And the parents come. And then they tell two friends. And they tell two friends. And before you know it, the demonstration that's got a few hundred people goes to a few thousand. And then 3 months later, like 5 million people in the Capitol demonstrating. It's definitely a grassroots movement of people come together. And it's not really that much for European integration. It's this guy is not accountable and he needs to go. And he leaves. And there's a really good film on Netflix these days, The Winner That Changed Us All, that sort of talks about, it's a primary source of people giving interviews of that thing. In March, as soon as the Winter Olympics are over, Putin seizes Crimea. Ukrainian military has been pretty much shut down for the last 20 years. Everything that could be sold was sold, and it goes without much of a blink. Putin continues to expand, and now the Ukrainian people start to come out. These are volunteers for the most part. One colleague who I had worked for before says, I get pulled in. We're trying to find through the scrapyards how many of these armored personnel carrier get the parts to make this thing run. He's got a bunch of 19-year-old snot-nosed kids with him who really don't know what they're doing. It's like, yep, this is what the future is going to be like. But he's not the only one. There's all these people start to volunteer. And the Ukrainian army, bankrupt, tries to fight. It does well against some of the puppet regimes that Moscow tries to put in order. But then when it looks like they're going to break through, Moscow decides to commit Russian ground troops. Ukrainians do mount a defense, but they're unable to stop these guys. Songs like Nobody But Us become popular. It's a heavy metal type music sound with videos of things blowing up, if you want to check it out. I think it's on YouTube these days. Things of like the defense of the Donetsk Airborne, the idea of these cyborgs, these guys that never give up, never surrender. They're in the building, they're pounded for 300 and some days. The building collapses, they don't. They sort of become national heroes. In 2015, there's a ceasefire. Most people in Europe think the war is over. But Ukrainians know that every day 3, 5, 6, 9, 12 people die. European leaders pat themselves on the back that they have reestablished peace. In reality, they just stuck their head really deep in the sand and don't hear the bullets going by. All right. And sometimes little facts happen that we don't sort of put together till later. As historians, we're sort of good at looking at that in the passing, those relationships, trying to define them. And in 2020, Lukashenko, who has been running Belarus as his own personal thing, loses an election. It's pretty well documented. Instead of giving power up, he asked Putin to keep him in power. Putin says, sure, I'll keep you in power, but here's the deal. Russian troops will be based in Belarus. These are generally ignored across the board of what's the geopolitical ramifications of it. But now Russia surrounds Ukraine on 3 sides. In 21, Russia continues to send troops to Ukraine. Most people in Ukraine are used to it. I have a good friend of mine who teaches at the Kiev-Molenska Academia in Kiev. And, I would look at his text periodically, and he would say, we're going to get invaded this month, and this couple months later, same thing again. They never happened. So most Ukrainians got used to living with war. And during this peace buildup, most Ukrainians don't want to have anything to do with it. They want to live their lives, surprisingly. In the last presidential elections, Ukrainians don't re-elect the old Winston Churchill type Poroshenko president. He's older, he's more sad, he talks a lot about religion, but gets a new guy who is an actor. He's the peace president. Right? That's why people elect him, because they want peace and move on. Right? He also happens to be Jewish. And for a while, Ukraine has a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. And Putin calls them Nazis. Yeah, clearly, something's different there. For us in the West, Nazi has a political meaning, right? For many Russians, the idea of Nazi is somebody who doesn't support Moscow. It's somebody who is an enemy of Moscow. That's what the word for word translation is. So if you see somebody being called a Nazi, it means not necessarily therefore authoritative system and dislikes, Jews. They have an anti-Moscow policy. So anybody who falls into that category is de facto a Nazi under this point of view. So Putin calls Ukraine a historical mistake and announces to correct it. And that's when the balloon sort of goes up that things are going to be happening. So why does Putin hate Ukraine so much? It represents everything that he despises. First of all, it's democratic. People live better than they do in Russia. Surprise, surprise. People in Moscow live decently. If you go outside of Moscow, that 50-mile or 60-mile radius, Most people don't have running water. Flush toilets are still considered a luxury. In Ukraine, people build a civic society. And even worse, it tolerates people who are different. In Ukraine, it doesn't really matter what your religion you're following. In Moscow, oh yeah, it does. So Putin apparently is trying to recreate the USSR. It was formed officially on paper in 1922, and he's going for trying to get the same thing. He's got Belarus in, he's got Russia in, and he thinks he can get Ukraine in. He's done. Didn't work out for him. His calls for a quick military conquest failed. And everybody in Ukraine seems to be resisting, from the top levels of government to grandmas and grandpas. People with one leg are on the front lines. That's a certain type of courage and a belief that this is our future, this is our better life. You may have seen the great picture of a grandma, little video telling people to take sunflowers. I love that. That is social resistance if ever there was. All right. It's possible that Putin can capture territory. When this thing starts, my thought is, yeah, it's easy to take territory, but it's sort of hard to hold it. You know, we've just gone through that in Afghanistan. The Soviets did the same thing. And seeing people from the Maidan, the revolution on granite, the Orange Revolution, I didn't think it was going to be that easy. Right? And I'm sort of glad to say I told you so. All those Western pundits who know everything thought that Moscow was going to win in a couple of hours. Sorry. So, will Putin win? It's unclear. But what is clear, innocent people are going to die, and it's happening continuously. Last night, I was watching some videos, because that's what I do at night. I don't go to sleep. I just sit and look at Facebook posting of what happened. There seems to be a lot of that between 10 and 1 in the morning. That they targeted the nuclear power plant. There's two of them, actually, that are attacked. The one in Zaporizhia, the one that gets a lot of the press. There's another one that's north that's also under attack. They targeted churches, hospitals. A colleague I talked to earlier said that, we both work in historic preservation. We should work with the UNESCO plan to document some of this destruction of cultural heritage. They blew up a folk museum, a folk art museum. We have one in here in town. Is that really a threat to anybody? From Putin's perspective, the existence of this thing shows that these people are doing things by themselves, and that's bad. So that's the reason why that museum was torched, specifically. There is fears that the cathedral that I showed, that wall, that 1,000-year-old thing is going to go. I'm sitting here in my warm, comfortable bed, teaching my classes, right, living while lots of friends and colleagues aren't. And I'm thinking, maybe I can talk. Maybe it'll help something. Maybe it's therapy. Who knows? But it looks to me like genocide. I am not a lawyer. That's not really my area of direction. But it seems if you're trying to wipe out a people and say they don't have a right to exist, that follows as under genocide. And that's a definition there that I've got on the PowerPoint. So if you want to do something, what can you do? There's an organization I've worked with. It's called Razumforukraine.org. It's a nonprofit. It's based in the United States. They've been around for over a decade. It's headed by an old friend of mine, an old colleague. They've been around since the invasion of 2014, helping people. They send things like coloring books for kids that are displaced. They also now have the right, they've got the legal paperwork to export things like flight jackets and helmets. Ukrainians are asking a lot for a no-fly zone to protect them from missiles. If you think this is a good idea, you can contact somebody. There's congressmen, there's the White House, there's all sorts of people you can say that, there should be a no-fly zone. You can boycott Russian goods. Every package that's sold in the United States got a little code on there. There's like a barcode and there's some numbers. 46 meat is made in Russia. Many of my friends have asked, don't buy anything that's made in Russia. And there are companies that continue to trade with Russia. Many companies in the United States and the West have stopped, from Adidas, no more two-piece tracksuits. All right. Yeah, I'm glad to say, yeah. But companies that have said that they will continue include Burger King and Coca-Cola. So Luke Oil, which is based in New Jersey, is Russian-owned. So there are still avenues that you can protest if you want to do something. So All right, that's pretty much all I got for today as a formal talk. I got a little bit of time. I'm sure you guys have questions, or thoughts you might want to share. I'll try to fill in the blanks. I'm not a the political kind of person that focuses on the contemporary politics of stuff. But I might have something for you. So I can't read Putin's playbook. I can't tell you the answer, what the long thing is, but if you have questions, please feel free to throw them forward. Say something if you want. Dr. Burgley, yes. All right, so Kazakh is actually a Tatar word. That's my understanding where it originates from. It means free men, outside the caste system, because pretty much all of Europe's got a little pyramid, that triangle thing. We got nobles and kings on tops, and you got town people, then you've got free men, and you've got serfs and slaves on the bottom. Kazakhs, by their very definition, were people who left that system, went outside it. Like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and all those guys who go out west, right, in the United States. Those are people in the PLC that go east. So they could be peasants, they could be town people, they could be a bastard son of a priest. Their background really didn't matter. They just went out to the frontier, and those are people who did their own thing, right? That's where the term comes from. It starts in Ukraine, and then it gets expanded. In the 19th century, Cossacks are used by the Russian Empire as pretty much an internal police force to document their will. So they keep their hands clean, but the Cossacks do the dirty work for them. By this time, Ukrainian Cossacks are pretty much gone. That's a good question. There is, Ukrainian government has their official web pages. I really haven't looked into that off the top of my head. Maybe I can come up with something and suggest something for you. I use predominantly Ukrainian language sources, which sometimes Google Translate will give you that little thing on the top or on the bottom, but you're going to miss some of the stuff on the inside, right? But there is, like, the Ukrainian military has their page and the social presence. There's a lot of misinformation. I'll tell you, don't look at Fox News. Unfortunately, that is sort of if you want to know what Moscow's thinking, that Mr. Tucker is really providing the job for him, right? Unfortunately, that's called propaganda, right? But the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian government webpage, President Zelensky gives speeches. Sometimes they're translated on the bottom, sometimes they're not. And look at reliable news sources like Rutgers, right? Wall Street Journal, it seems to be relatively on the mark. So that might be a good starting point. Yes. Demonstrations in the United States or demonstrations in Europe or in Russia? I guess that's okay. So there are demonstrations in the United States. It's great to go to a demonstration. You never been to one. Doesn't matter what it is. I think it's something everybody should experience sometime in their life, right? But it's also got a fun thing as a social thing going on. Does it make a difference? I don't know. I'm sort of of two minds about it. There was one in Lexington on Wednesday. I chose not to go because it was going to be much more of a fun carnival effect, right? And right now I got too much anger to go into a peaceful demonstration. So they are signs of solidarity, which help and makes people feel not abandoned, because unfortunately in Ukraine's 350-year struggle against the Russian Empire, they felt abandoned for most of their history. So that helps. But can you do something else with that time? Possibly. We try to do small things, and you don't know how they're going to end up. So we did have a thing I sort of brought forth the faculty senate. We have a senator here who might want to say something. So, we're not the only school that's doing this. There's a lot of colleagues. They're doing the same thing at their institutions. MIT did something recently. I think Berkeley's got something on the books right now. So I think it helps, right? People understand that they're not alone. But if somebody's shelling you, or you just saw a family member lose their life, is that going to be enough? Probably not. But it's a start. Yes, sir. Yes. I was involved with a couple of organizations in 2014 when this started happening. We have very specific licenses what we can and we cannot send out of the United States. Just because you can buy night vision something, right, telescope, doesn't mean you can send it because somebody comes in a suit knocking on your door. The only organization that I know of has the paperwork that pushed to get it is the helmets and the flak jackets, and that's the Razum for Ukraine. They had a fundraiser. Right now I think they're trying to raise $500,000. I think they're like $50 short. I'm shocked how very quickly that kind of thing. They have the paperwork to do it. The organizations and friends I have in Poland that I work with, they will buy things there, but they have their laws, right? And pretty much military surplus stores in Warsaw right now I know are empty. There's nothing there. So that's more difficult. Again, it's also the cost beneficial thing. When it started in 2014, one of my former students and I, Pat Davis, got a bunch of socks together. And you think socks are sort of, but for people who are in the military, clean socks, dry socks are a lifesaver. And we were able to send that. But it takes more money to actually send the package than the cost of the item. So some of these organizations are trying to figure out, okay, what's the most cost-effective way? Because they're not there to make money off you, or at least the reputable ones are, right? I'm sure there's some scam artists out there. But the other organizations, that's why I like this Razum one, because they've been doing it for 10 years. They've got their people, they know their laws, and they're very, very smart. So I would suggest that's one. There's others out there, but that's one that I sort of trust, and that's going to be the biggest bang for your buck. Yes, sir. Well, that's a good question. It's unknown, right? For most Western societies, we sort of want to be integrated with each other. Russia seems to want to put up a wall between themselves. I mean, part of Putin's dream is to recreate the Soviet Union, including the Iron Curtain, right? Sort of separating it out. So is it going to help or is it going to hurt is a very good question. I have colleagues that are debating this, continuously. Will it sort of make an us and a them kind of thing? Will it help Putin's supporters that, oh my God, the evil West is out to get poor little Russia again? How dare they? So I'll support my president more. It's unclear. But it's not helping him. And, having things run out of vehicles, running out of tanks and parts, and can get certain engines, I'm all there for it, right? I think, most people are in the same direction that think that we're not sure how much is going to help and when it will kick in, but it's not helping him. And if, it could be a little spoke in a wheel that you stick in there, and maybe it will have an effect. I'll give it a shot. You see videos of people standing up to armored personnel carriers and tanks and being shot. This is the least we can do, I think. Shoot. Well, this is not really research, right? Because, I deal with a battlefield from the 17th century or even the early 20th century. I'm really good with, right? Because that's what I've been reading and writing about. The 21st century stuff is all new, right? And the inner circles of Putin's government is unclear. But there were oligarchs that stood up against him before, and they're either dead or on the run. One of them was living in, I think, New Jersey or Connecticut, put $1 million bounty on Putin's head, right? I think we should have a FundMe page, right? See if we get those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers, right? But it's hard to guess. And this thing I keep on coming back to 1991, right? It looked like the Soviet Union is all powerful. It's got so many tanks, it's got so many planes, it's got so many shiny things. And 3 days later, absolutely useless. Gorbachev can't afford to pay his electric bill and has to leave the office by the end of the year. So could it go like that? possibly, if we look at history as an indication, 1917, Tsarist Empire looks really, really good, and then one bad snowstorm and they're gone. Right? The same thing might happen now. We don't know. I hope to God every day that Putin's no longer with us. Right? When I wake up, that's going to be the best day of my life. Right? But it's hard to tell. And if we can sort of help it come about, I'm okay with that. Yep. Right. It's hard to say, right? There's a meme or social media thing that's going on in Ukraine, that shows 5,000 Russian protesters and one Russian cop shows up and they all run away. In Ukraine, that they sort of make fun of that because of all the events that have happened, 91, the Orange Revolution, the Maidan of 13 and 14, it was of all people coming together. And it doesn't seem to be that level of solidarity, for lack of a better term, has yet happened in Russia. It's unclear. And again, we're getting fragments because Russian media does not want to have these kind of challenges being appeared. There's been some lukewarm letters written by certain Russians condemning the effects of the invasion. There are some people who still support Putin no matter what. Right? The opera singer at the Met was saying Putin's their best friend. Right? Finally, they got rid of her today, apparently. So it's hard for us to know what's going on there because it is a different world. And whatever happens, it's clear that nobody's going to ask my kids, Russia, oh, you're Ukrainian? Is that like Russia? I think that's pretty much clear across the board. It's not, right? And for us to know what's going on there, we haven't been really close together for 30 years. Most Ukrainians have wanted to have their own lives. They don't really care what's going on in Moscow. Moscow seems to obsess about what's going on in Ukraine, and we've sort of moved on beyond it, right? We have our own lives. We don't care. So it's even sort of hard to judge, and even Ukrainian scholars are like, I don't know what's going on in Russia because it's a different country. It's like, do we know the intricacies of what's going on in Canada? We have our own lives. We were not obsessing about it. It's the same kind of thing. It's a different nation. David?
Do you think rallying for a ban of importation of Russian?
I think so. I mean, symbolically, if not directly. And like I said, if it hurts, you've heard the phrase, freedom has a price, and you might have to pay that at the pump, unfortunately. But I think it's worth it. I'm sorry, I only heard part of that. Yeah, he's asked for volunteers. Sort of like we did, we had a Lincoln Brigade during the Spanish Civil War where we had people who sort of wanted to stop growth of fascism, right? And went to Spain and volunteered. Hemingway, that's where he writes his stuff, right? And Zelensky's asking for the same kind of thing. There's a call among former military to do some sort of like a Flying Tigers kind of thing. We'll see. It's hard to tell because this is all sort of new. Ukraine has a standing army. It's had one for 30 years, right? It's sort of grown and developed. It's got what is the equivalent of a National Guard, right? It's been on the books, again, for maybe 12 years now, all right? I think maybe earlier, but wasn't really active. And now they've got the Territorial Defense Unit, which means 3 or 4 of your buddies from your building are getting together and are going to go steal a tank. Right, that's literally what it is. So it's literally a people's movement across the board, and it's multi-ethnic, it's multicultural. Ukraine's got different languages, different religions, right? There's a thing going around. There's some gypsies who stole a tank, right? So we'll see. But I do know that there was a call for volunteers, and according to a couple of websites that I've seen, and again, I haven't really kept up on the American side of it, that some of them are sort of filled to capacity. Right, of the number of volunteers that they'll take. They're looking for people, obviously, with previous military training. So that's the ideal, and there's a vetting process I'm sure that goes through. So, yes, sir.
Amazing those are staying at fight. Those that have fled the country, like, do you think that possibly a larger Ukrainian population in America is possibly to go stay in like Europe? And to stay, like, you think they'll stay in Europe or is it like
Well, the people are fleeing predominantly are women and kids, right? The law in the book says men are supposed to stay, women and children go. Obviously, some will get out, but if you look at the pictures, it's almost all women and kids, all right, which are fleeing. There's 1 million of them right now in Poland. American Reporter asked to see the refugee camps, and Poland said there aren't any camps. They're in people's houses. People are literally volunteering to take people into their home as a crisis is going on. Poland's gone through some really terrible things in the 20th century. They can sort of relate to it. And they're trying to help Ukraine as much as they can. So most of the people don't want to leave their country, which I get. My grandma to her day said she just wants to die back home in free Ukraine. Fortunately, it didn't happen. Didn't get to live to see that. But, most refugees don't want to be refugees. They want to go home. Will some stay and build lives? It's possible. Who knows what will happen, right? It's hard to say. Yes.
So I know Ukraine is in need of everything. But I've been speaking with some people who want to donate, and they're asking me if they should donate to the Ukrainian military or to humanitarian efforts.
It depends on their perspective, right? There's some people who feel strong enough they want to help militarily, right? The people defend themselves and have no problem of, sniper rifles, whatever happens to be. A couple of Turkish drones would be awesome, that I know they're really popular right now. Some people are less comfortable with that, and everybody's different, right? So if they're more interested in the humanitarian thing, that aid will also help. I mean, there's a great need for medical supplies, blood, all sorts of things, right? There are volunteer doctors that are going. There's a group that went from Israel that I saw show up, and are trying to do triage. For me, the most disturbing picture is not the buildings, it's the people, right? And when you see a photograph of a dead child that got shelled, that just, I can't get that out of my head. Whatever you feel comfortable and what level you're feeling comfortable with, do it. All right? I mean, we are in a free society. That's the wonders of being in a free society. I'm not telling you what to do, right? I'm just sharing information and my thoughts on what's going on. And if you feel you want to do something, then, pardon the expression, get off your ass and do it, all right? So, yes. Well, that's a loaded question, right? It depends on each country, right? Belarus has sort of got dragged into it. There's clear evidence that Belarusians don't want it either. Some of them have surrendered en masse. Others are actually changing sides. It's unclear how far that's going to go, right? There are people in Moldavia which are really concerned because there's this Russian puppet right next door between Ukraine and them. Romania is on high alert. But Poland is safe. I'm supposed to take students this summer to Poland, and I think Poland is safe. I mean, talking to people there, it is probably got it's got the 82nd Airborne in there right now. Right? So if something happens there, then we're really going to be talking Third World War. And it doesn't matter if you're in Pikeville or if you're, in Przemyśl. It's not going to be good. Right? That's a worst case scenario. Will Putin use nukes? That's sort of the question. Lavrov made a public statement not too long ago, Russia's foreign minister, that we're not crazy, we won't use nukes. But the man's lied continuously for the last 20 years, right? So who knows? I don't think anybody wants a nuclear war. That's the thing everybody is going to want to happen, not happen, right? Everybody doesn't want to have a chemical attack. But the fact that you're shelling a nuclear power station, it's a war crime, right? Because you've already pushed the envelope. And how far will it go? It's unclear, right? If Putin is unable to win militarily, what's his off-ramp, as they say, right? It's unclear. Hopefully it'll end in him in a bunker with a bullet in his head, right? That's the easiest scenario. The other thing is people are talking about is China. Expected China to have a much stronger support for Russia during these attacks. I mean, they had the whole thing with Taiwan. And they've been strangely silent, right? They haven't said anything, which makes me worry. I mean, there's that pressure as well. Who knows what will happen? I mean, At this point, we're trying to predict that crystal ball thing, and that's anybody's guess. Yes.
Another question from Nancy Gowler. Can you speak to the divisions within the Orthodox Church and its presence / leadership in Ukraine as opposed to that of the Russian Orthodox Church? And do these divisions play into the conflict?
Well, that's a very good question. One of my childhood friends ended up becoming the Ukrainian Catholic bishop and has started the Catholic University in View and now is in Philadelphia. And he actually addressed that whole question right now. That looks like there are, through historical purposes, there are different Christian churches in Ukraine. You have Baptists and you have Pentecostals, you have Methodists. But the major religions, Ukrainian Catholic Church, which sort of supports the Pope, you have Ukrainian Orthodox Church that sort of supports the Orthodox version, not the Moscow one. And then there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Muscovy. That's just these are the major ones, right? That is the one that's, well, seems to be working as the right hand of Putin's regime. And in 2014, a couple of these churches were broken into, and they found that they had all this weaponry and all this Russian propaganda stuff. So how that is going to play out is to be seen, but it looks like there is talks about the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is predominantly in the western part of the country, about 10% of the population, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is, I don't know, I want to guess their numbers, but of coming together and finding some sort of, because ideologically they're not really opposed, it's just historical traditions why they're different. Any other questions? Thoughts? Comments? Yes.
Sort of American politics and at least here in our own country, and Putin's boldness to just sort of say, you know, spare the universe, I'm going against Ukraine and I'll demolish the damn country if I choose.
Well, I mean, there are some parallels between our previous president and Putin's and their way of thinking, you know, being crazy and doing whatever they want to do, right? Like a little child that's never been told no and didn't get to go in the corner and stand, right? Well, I find it sort of fascinating, the shift. You know, when we were younger, say both of us, right? Republicans generally stood for Soviets bad, right? Authoritarian regimes, evil, right? You know, that's what the whole Reagan thing was about, pretty much, right? And then, you know, that was there with John McCain, right? He was, when he came to Ukraine, when there were demonstrations, there's even a couple of streets named after the guy. I mean, he's considered a Ukrainian hero because he stood up for us. That's what Republicans used to mean. And then there was a shift, right? And it sort of got connected as, you know, Putin talks about the white race and all this other kind of stuff. He's got his ideologues, and then some of the, I'd say crazies, probably the more accurate description, or the heavily engaged, maybe that one, right? Are pushing the same kind of agenda, the David Dukes of this world, right? Is there a connection? Yeah, there's a couple Americans that sort of believe that strongly. They're actually fighting for Putin. But, you know, there's also people who don't believe in vaccines and flat Earth, and the Holocaust didn't happen, right? And that's part of, I guess, what my training has been for the last how many years, right? And what I've been doing is trying to help people figure this stuff out. So I don't have all the answers. Unfortunately, it's on you to figure some stuff out. I can give you hints, I can give you suggestions, I can point you in directions, I can, you know, discuss things with you. But in the end, you got to figure these things out. And some people will see connections and make these sort of parallels that other people don't. That's what makes us sort of unique, right? We are all different, and yet when we come together, we get a better understanding of the world, which is sort of weird, you know? Yeah, and that's what Putin's really trying to destroy. His work, as one of my colleagues refers to it, is trying to be very hierarchical. Guy on top dictates everything, everybody follows, right? It's almost the old Mongol style. Everybody kneels in front of the big guy. Right? In our society, civil society, is what we sort of respect, and definitely in Ukraine, it's the opposite. Most people are, I won't say mistrustful, but leery towards government institutions. But if push comes to shove, they come together like crazy, which is sort of nice to see. And hopefully this trend will continue. David, I think we got.
Yeah, kind of adding to that. What implications does this conflict have for the American ability to kind of withdraw from world leadership? You know,
Well, it's a test, right? We got to be a great power in 1945 and sort of fell into our hands, right? Great Britain's gone, France is gone. It's the kids have grown up, and there you go. You got the keys. Figure it out, right? In the last, and that was sort of an edge in 1945 because we had everything. You know, if it was a car, it was going to be made in the United States. You know, Volkswagen wasn't producing much. Neither was Mitsubishi, right? Now the world has changed. It's been 70 years, right? And it's sort of a different place. What's our role in the world? Well, figure what we want to do, right? In this crisis, it looks like other European countries are actually leading the way, and we're sort of playing catch up, right? If you go through like things of shutting down banks, shutting down airspace, in Canada, shut down the airspace before we did, right? You know, if we want to act globally, we talk about acting globally, and never again, then you know, we got to put the big boy pants on, right? Unfortunately, that causes some people don't want to do that. That's where we're at, unfortunately, today. Yep. Well, I think Zelensky has proven himself not the peace candidate, right? I want peace. I want to have a good time. But if you push me, you know, it doesn't work for you, right? You know, he's clearly gone on the stage. He's not capitulating. It's not him alone, though, right? We like to think of the one person. And one thing I admire him is he said, "Don't put my picture on the wall. Put your picture of, you know, of your dad or your kids. That's what you're really focusing on." And it's across the board. It's from, you know, boxers, sports people, right? Millionaires who live at home, do nothing, right? And then they're actually coming to Ukraine and volunteering to fight. So it's across this board. Zelensky is part of this whole general idea that we're all in this together. We're all different, but we're all in this together because we got a common thread, and we're going to come in together for the common good, right? And that's really what we're seeing. We live in a commonwealth, right? Sort of lost that idea, I think, somewhere along the way. We need to come together for a common good. And Ukraine sort of, you know, makes me really proud of what direction they're going. Who could have thought, you know, a Jewish president in a country that's run by Nazis, right? Yeah. All right. So I think that what last question, and we'll call it after that. Does that sound fair? You can. Well, technology is a lot different. Let's go with that. You know, everything's changed in the last 70 years or so, right? I'm not sure it goes faster, and it'll be hopefully televised, and hopefully there'll be people able to see it, except just the cockroaches, right? Because we could crack the core of the planet. Done. All right, we don't have to worry about it anymore. We don't want it that, right? We, you know, as the old adage says, you know, we don't want war, but we have to prepare for it. And unfortunately, it's thrust on us. How are we going to figure it out to deal with it? It's all of us to figure out together. All right. Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great weekend. Thank you.